Welcome to the Ricky Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank Studio. Hope you're having a great day as we continue to celebrate so many incredible people working so hard to make this a great place to live, work, and play. I had a bit of a transformative moment recently when my friend Ashley Edwards, the former CEO of the Gulf Coast Business Council, and now a serial entrepreneur and doing so well with his life, I had the opportunity to watch a Southern Miss TEDx talk. I think it was, we'll get this from Ashley here in just a second, but I think it was the first one they've done at Southern Miss. And he was the first speaker. And he talked about the blue economy. And as he talked about the blue economy, there are so many important points that he made about the exponential aspect of the changes that we're undergoing now in our economy, and then how it ultimately impacts us here in coastal Mississippi. It kind of builds off Colin Napier and the conversation that he and I had recently about this growing AI thing. I've said that 30% of the jobs are going to be directly impacted in a very short period of time, and I don't know if we're ready for it. But what the governor's trying to do is integrate AI thinking into the education framework of this state, which I think is very wise. The universities are embracing it. Even private universities like William Carey are embracing it. But it's more than AI. But AI is a major factor here. But what I observed in this TED talk that Ashley gave about the blue economy, it really kind of blew my mind. And we've talked about it on this show many times, but he captured it so beautifully. I'm gonna post his TED talk at our Ricky Matthews Show website. But I wanted to invite Ashley to join me today so we can talk about my thought is we aren't necessarily reading those tea leaves the way we need to in coastal Mississippi. You can be the judge of that. I don't think we are, and I've written about that. But anyway, without any further ado, let me welcome Ashley Edwards back to the Ricky Matthews Show. Ashley, how you doing, my friend?
Hey, Ricky, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me today.
Okay, so I'm out running, and I plugged in the TED Talk, and I listened to it very carefully. And man, was it good. It was really good. Right off the bat, man, this notion about this definition, blue economy, is that literally your term that you use in your paper?
It's a term that I started to kind of hear circulating around in the early 2010s. I think the first time it was ever used was in San Diego, California. And it was a little bit of a different usage, but there was a group of people there that were trying to define the economic impact that the waterborne or maritime based industries in San Diego had on their regional economy. And I read a study that they had written a few years previous, and there was a reference in there to the economy being blue. And I just thought, sometimes there's a lot of power in being able to give something a name. And so I went with that back in, a long time ago now, when I was an economic developer and also finishing my graduate degree at Southern Miss in economic development, and did this study trying to define this concept of the blue economy in Mississippi. And it wasn't just coastal. I mean, it was really looking at, well inland, the things that would not be in Mississippi if it weren't for the fact that we've got the Gulf of Mexico and all the commerce it creates. And that includes the obvious things that you would think of, whether it's, water-based gaming or shipbuilding or seafood processing. But it also includes a lot of things you wouldn't think of. Stennis Space Center is part of the blue economy. And one of the reasons for that is because they have to bring in the fuel sources for the testing of rockets by barge. So the ability to get that in on the intercoastal waterway was the strategic reason for that being there. Naval Air Station Meridian exists in Meridian because it is the primary place in the Navy that pilots can do over water flight testing in the test ranges in the Gulf of Mexico. And it's one of the few places they have available to do that type of work out of Meridian. So, well into the northern sections of the state, there's economic activity that's related directly to this Gulf of Mexico. And when we started to define that, what we were able to do is show that there was a nexus that nearly 70% of jobs had some direct relation or were impacted in some way by the Gulf proximity. And if the Gulf wasn't there, those jobs likely wouldn't be there either.
It's amazing. It's amazing how that all came about. And then you started to use the term, people started sort of adopting the term, and things continue to kind of roll down the road rapidly. But it's a great way to frame it because, see, I think context is really important. And you got to define, in order to know where you want to go, you got to kind of define where you are now. And when you're talking about economic development, everything's very measurable, especially when you start to consider the massive changes that are ahead of us. And we'll come back to that in just a second. But how did it come? I think you mentioned this before, but just remind us, how did you come to be the first speaker for the first TEDx talk at Southern Miss?
Well, it's an interesting story because it's been many years ago when I was at Southern Miss, and I did this blue economy study as my master's thesis. And decade and or more now has passed, and I would have never imagined that anyone would have even remembered that. Obviously the blue economy concept took off, but it's not something I've been directly involved in. And there were actually some folks at Southern Miss when they were putting together and had worked with TEDx to create the first ever TED Talks about the blue economy. They remembered that I had done that study and called and said, "Hey, is this something you would be willing to consider doing?" I was very honored to do it. And they gave me a lot of latitude about how I approached it. And so what I wanted to do, um, you know, it's interesting because when they called, the first thing I did was I went and pulled that study up and I read it. And it's probably the first time I have read it in 12 years. I mean, I haven't even looked at it since I did it. And what immediately struck me was not all of the things that I tried to define then, but knowing what I know now, all the things I could not have known then or that I totally missed out on then. And so I really wanted to take the talk in a direction to say, yeah, we named what was going on here, but that wasn't the important part. The important part is how this model works in the future that is coming.
Well, what's so okay? And then you developed sort of these chapters in your talk, and you put everybody in a time machine. You went back in the time in the year 2005 when Katrina hit, and you kind of walked us through your own personal experience, what led you ultimately to the governor's recovery team, leading that team eventually, which is, as you pointed out, the largest rebuilding effort in the history of the U.S. that you had the opportunity to be a part of here in Mississippi. And then, on to be in economic development, on to get your graduate degree in economic development, which led to this paper on the blue economy. And so, that kind of helped people understand sort of where you got to that point and why you wrote about it. But then the chapter takes you on from there. And disruption became such a big part of that. It wasn't just AI, but it's just the changing nature of things. And you went out of your way to describe, you actually used a grain of rice to describe how quickly you can get to a situation through iterations and by sort of exponential impact, where you end up in a very short period of time with too much rice to feed the entire world. I mean, that's just so and I think it was a great way to describe how exponential change can impact us. But this chapter on disruption means more now than if you would have gone back and study what you wrote even 5 years ago, Ashley. Look at where we are today as it relates to that. But that's the thing. I think that, I mean, the whole framing around blue economy was awesome. It was extraordinarily well done. I don't know how you take such a complex topic and kind of boil it down to a TED Talk that's consumable in a very short period of time. But it wouldn't have been the same. It wouldn't have meant anything that it meant had you not had the moment that we're in right now with the disruptive nature of this moment. And so I see we're coming to the end of this segment. So what we're going to do, we're going to pick it up right there. And we're going to describe what the disruption is. And what does that mean for us? And how do we get our arms around it? What's the implications of it? Can we even get our arms around it? That's a real question. I think that's where you ended your talk in discussing the reef. Where are we? How do we do this? Can we do it? We will see. We'll see you on the other side with Ashley Edwards. We'll see you after this. Welcome back to the Ricky Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank Studio. We're visiting with Ashley Edwards. He's the former CEO of the Business Council. He's kind of a big-time entrepreneur these days, doing extremely well. Someone I circle back with on a regular basis. And he wrote back in graduate school a paper on the blue economy and had the opportunity recently to do a TED Talk at Southern Miss, the very first TED Talk at Southern Miss about the blue economy. And I was making the point before we went to break that that TED Talk wouldn't have meant the same if he had given it 5 or 10 years ago, looking back on what he wrote about the blue economy. And before we get to the disruption and all of that and why that's more powerful now, I think it was interesting you made the point that that these businesses and industries and companies, et cetera, that were part of the blue economy, they didn't really even know they were part of the blue economy. It was a serendipitous evolution over time. But what naming the blue economy did is give us the opportunity to really begin to appreciate the people who work here, the companies that are here, the governmental entities that are here. Which of these, and as you just pointed out, it's really not just the coast. It goes really all over the state. What's literally tied, our success or failure is tied to the Gulf of Mexico. That was a profound revelation, wasn't
it? It was, and a lot of that was born from kind of, I guess, what my philosophy was back when I was in grad school. Economic development is not the most sexy topic in the world. But when I was in grad school, I felt like that we were really changing from a playbook that didn't work anymore. Back in those days, it was all about recruiting smokestacks. How do you get the next factory to come locate in your area? And you could see then, although certainly we had no idea the speed at which that change and evolution would occur, but you could see then that things were really starting to evolve. And so what I was trying to do was define something more as an economic ecosystem as opposed to an individual industry or an individual employer, because these and really it was born out of this idea of the disruption from Hurricane Katrina. I think I said in my TED talk, the 20th century model was like a factory. Factories are efficient, and factories work very well until their systems break, and then the factory goes under. They don't have the ability to adapt, and you have to have more of an economic ecosystem that is adaptable, because you know we used to think of disruption in terms of a big event, Hurricane Katrina hitting, the Great Recession, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And so many of our systems were built around, let's be able to respond to an event and try to recover from it. But this future that's already upon us, disruptions are not going to be events. It's going to be AI and technological change and population collapse, and 50% of the jobs in America changing in what seems like almost overnight, and the baby boomer workforce retiring. I mean, you're just going to have all of these disruptions that are going to completely collapse the systems that we built for the 20th century model. And so my purpose for, kind of giving this talk was to say, in effect, as we tried to develop this blue economy concept, we had to develop something that looked at ecosystems rather than silos and looked at adaptability rather than stringent efficiency. And that's not just a model for coastal Mississippi, it's a model for our whole civilization in the 21st century because everybody's going to face it. Every economy, every region is going to have to deal with those realities.
And some will have advantages and some won't. And I think because of where we're positioned, we have an advantage. And so, too often people see our positioning as a disadvantage because of hurricanes. And we use that as an excuse, actually, sometimes why we are not more aggressive, more proactive in building that economy that you're talking about. And let's take a look. Look, we're going to come back and we're going to zero in a little bit on all of this. But this notion of us being an economy that has been built, at least in the last 20 years because of Katrina, built on disruption. And, the growth that has happened here, a lot of it came from disaster relief. Disaster spending. While other communities, and I've written about many of them, like in Savannah and Northwest Florida, the Golden Triangle, where they were focused on building a diversified economy, advanced manufacturing, and so on during the 20 years that we were recovering, we were having good growth related to government dollars coming in here rebuilding stuff as a result of Hurricane Katrina. So, we were responding, and it was saving us in a lot of ways because a lot of dollars were circulating in this community. But during that time, we were not doing what they were doing. And so in some respect, this is what I've been writing about. In some respect, we were sort of behind the eight ball because of that. It's just a reality of our condition. And so the point that you're making is the disruption that we were used to responding to, which was disaster related. We've got to shift gears and change the entire context for how we view disruption, because the disruption that's on us, not that's coming, that's here,
Right.
is going to be very substantial. And that's one of the reasons why I've been saying we better get aligned in coastal Mississippi around that. But let's define something. You talked about the factory economy versus the reef economy. That's essentially what you were referring to just a few minutes ago. But just so that when we mention reef economy versus factory economy, when we say it, let's make sure people know what we're talking about.
So, what I was trying to really draw a contrast there. We come from this 20th century model that was based on the Industrial Revolution that began even before that and has continued on into our lifetimes. And the way that it had to be built around these siloed institutions, whether it's a factory or a university, a corporation, you name it, it's these big institutions. And what I really talked about was that model is not going to survive in this next era because it can't. Um, and we're going to have to look for something different. And so what I looked at was a coral reef. On a coral reef, um, it faces disruption all the time. Climate change, storms that tear the reef apart. Water temperature change. You name it, they face disruptions, but they've had to learn this resilience and adaptability. But on a reef, everything is symbiotic and interdependent. One species can't survive without the other. And, we used to look at economies from the standpoint of, hey, if we can land one big factory in town, that'll save us for the rest of our lives. When that factory closes, these towns go under. And we've seen many of those things happen in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s as the economy has shifted. And so what I'm really talking about is more of a model of this interdependence or this symbiosis, where you're creating common workforce skills and knowledge sets and educational programs, and industries that are all working on the same types of things in similar fields, so that you get this compounding effect. If one goes under, the others can pick up that slack, absorb the lost workforce, and the whole can survive, just like what happens on on a coral reef. And as I was trying to think of an analogy really for what that model looked like, I kept coming back to this idea of a coral reef. And it obviously fits the whole ocean theme very well. But we've got to think about our future economic systems as coral reefs in which you have all of these diverse things working together for common survival, as opposed to silos that we're going to build up but that might not be able to respond to the disruptions that come. Ricky, you and I have talked about it before. There are amazing American companies that have lasted for 100 years, that have employed tens of thousands of people, that by the time our children and grandchildren are in the workforce won't exist anymore because they will not be able to go through the change. It's funny. I started one of the kind of little jokes I made at the beginning of the TED Talk when we stepped back in time to 2005 was, 2005 was a different time and Netflix still came in the mail and Blockbuster was still winning that battle. It's a perfect analogy of the way that they could not respond to the disruption that hit them. 20 years ago, they were building blockbusters on every corner in every town in America. And almost overnight, they went under because technology disrupted them and they just weren't ready for it. And that's going to happen all throughout our economy. And frankly, it's already happening. We're seeing it right now.
Yeah, of course, look at the newspaper industry. One of the things I
Yeah.
often think about, Ashley, is that the iPhone wasn't introduced by Steve Jobs until 2 years after Hurricane Katrina.
Right.
And in that moment, we didn't, I kind of knew it because we had just finished, the strategic planning effort for Knight Ridder, the one that owned the Sun Herald. And my thought and our notes to each other was game over. Game over. It changed everything. When we come back, we're gonna really drill down on disruption and why that's such an important part of the conversation, because I don't think we're focused on that enough. We'll see you after this break. Welcome back to the Ricky Matthews Show. We're visiting with Ashley Edwards, talking about a recent TED Talk he did for Southern Miss, the very first TED Talk, the very first speaker. Ashley Edwards talking about the blue economy, formerly CEO of the Business Council. He's an entrepreneur doing really well, working across a bunch of states. He's really, really, really smart guy, somebody I've always respected greatly and enjoy having his point of view on this show. He's also been a SuperTalk Mississippi contributor along the way. But so what I want to do now in this segment, I really want to zero in on the disruption because, the disruption that Hurricane Katrina brought, I often said after I went to that leadership program at Northwestern, and Robert J. Danzig, the former CEO for the Hearst Corporation, who owns at the time, I'm assuming they still do, the San Francisco Chronicle, was for our graduation ceremony. He was our speaker. And, he talked about this powerful lubrication, that change that comes from pain. I talk about it all the time, that when people can see the pain and they feel the pain, like Hurricane Katrina, for example, they're willing to go, it will cause a lubrication to change. Sometimes we don't see the pain or we don't feel the pain. It's still there. We're just avoiding it or whatever. And his point was, don't avoid it. See the pain, adjust now. Don't wait for drastic things to happen to cause you to have to change. Like, for example, you gave the Blockbuster example a minute ago. If they would have just embraced technology the way that Netflix had, they would have, because Netflix, if you remember, they were, through the mail or through these machines that they adopted new technology and literally put Blockbuster out of business. If Blockbuster would have seen that coming, they could have begun to think about that too. They may not have won, but at least they would have given it a shot. They didn't even really by the time they figured it out, it was too late. Netflix had already gained so much there. So this powerful lubrication from change. So what I want you to do is talk a little bit about the disruption. This economy in coastal Mississippi has been very disruption based for the past 20 years, been very focused on recovering from Hurricane Katrina while others were growing and diversifying. That's just real, isn't it?
It's incredibly real. And, I tried to really choose the words I used in that speech very carefully. And there's a reason that the first words I used was, it is said that true intelligence is the ability to see the future. We often take for granted that business leaders or elected officials, those that we trust and empower to make big important decisions, kind of have a handle on what's going on. The Blockbuster example is a perfect example. Their executives could not see the future. I'll give you another one. I mean, Ricky, you think about your childhood and my childhood. At every store you ever walked into, every point of sale retail location, there was a film developing kiosk with a Kodak logo on it. Kodak Eastman Company was one of the biggest companies in the world for more than 100 years. It was a Kodak Eastman engineer that invented the digital camera, and their executives could not come to terms with the fact that if they adopted that technology, it was going to hurt their film business. They're a company that's gone completely away now after 100 years of being on top in a literally a world economy, and that is going to continue to happen. And that is because it's very difficult sometimes to see the changes that are coming. You I think the point you made about what you heard at Northwestern is a perfect one. When a major Category 5 hurricane hits our coast, we don't have to go and convince people to get involved in responding to the disruption because it's so obvious that we are in a crisis. I would offer to you that the disruption that we are seeing with this next industrial revolution that we are already in is going to be magnitudes worse on our economy than what a single hurricane has ever done. And it's not just going to affect us, it's going to affect everybody. But yet, the vast majority of people kind of have their head in the sand and they're saying, well, let's just do what we've always done. Let's just be what we've always been. It's always, the playbook we've run has always worked for us. So let's just keep running the same plays. And, the executives at Kodak Eastman said that, the executives at Blockbuster said that, and look at where it got them. And so, there's a lot of lessons to be learned from history. And there's going to be a lot of cautionary tales in the things that are going to happen in the future. The people that survive what's coming are going to be the ones that are ready and willing to adapt. The ones that don't are going to be the ones that hang on tightly to the way that things have always been and the status quo.
So, so bring that to kind of the here and now. When I talk to people on the show, like John Harrison from Hancock Whitney, and he says some of the fastest growing areas of his multi-state company, banking industry, is in the Florida Panhandle, which you do some work there, so you know that. When I talk to Dave Dennis from Specialty Contractors, who has a very, he does drywall and things like that in the commercial space. And so when something's being built in the commercial space, he's all over it. For example, he's all over working on data centers in Mississippi, for an example, but not here on the coast. When you look at the work that they're doing over, I think, 7 states, virtually none of it is happening in the coast of Mississippi. When you talk to people in the construction industry, like Roy Anderson, for example, they're not building much here in coastal Mississippi, if anything. So when they say we're not building stuff, that's not to say that there's not a new business opening up or something over here and, a single or double happening every now and then. But the reality is the kind of new stuff that we built a lot of stuff after Katrina because we were rebuilding stuff. Okay. But all that's kind of run its course now for the most part, except for some infrastructure stuff that's still kind of hanging out there even 20 years after Katrina. What does that tell you when you have key people saying we're not building stuff? Did you see that before you left the business council? That
oh, absolutely,
we
absolutely.
better do more.
That was, in many ways, that was probably my most important singular focus during my years there. It was just absolutely clear when you analyze the data, we were not keeping up. And it's really amazing because you go back 25 years to the turn of the century. Mississippi Gulf Coast was really on fire economically. I mean, there were a lot of even national groups that were pointing to us as one of the real boom regions in the United States. Um, Obviously, the disruptions of Katrina and the recession and the oil spill had a lot to do with that. We probably had more economic disruption here than just about any other area of the country in the last 20 years. Um, but we weren't keeping up, and now what we find is we're really getting out competed by almost all of the competitive markets that we see in other places, in certainly in the Gulf Coast and in coastal America in general. And that was borne out in the data. We saw, you might look at just the raw job numbers, for example, Ricky, and say, well, we're down 1,000 jobs. But when you looked underneath that next layer of data, we might have been down 1,000 jobs total, but we had 12,000 jobs that changed from high wage jobs to low wage service sector jobs. And we've seen that compounding year after year after year. So our economy doesn't even look anything today, frankly, what it looked like in 2005, the day that before Katrina hit. And it's not getting any easier because we've had economy that has been primarily focused in three sectors: government, military installations, Stennis Space Center, government institutions, um, manufacturing and things like shipbuilding and in tourism. And two of those sectors are changing incredibly quickly because we can't depend on the government money to be flowing like it always has. Certainly, manufacturing automation is going to fundamentally change that. I mean, Ingalls Shipbuilding is an incredible industry, but they do what they do out there today with half as many employees as they once had. And then, as it relates to coastal tourism, another incredibly changing sector. And so, we just cannot depend on the next 20 years looking like the last 20 have. In fact, I would dare say we can't even comprehend what the next 20 years is going to look like. Um, and I think that is in many ways even more important than the response that we had to Hurricane Katrina. I know it's hard to say that, Ricky, and it almost might sound crazy, but if we don't get this right going into the next 20 years, there's not going to be a federal bailout to save us. There's not going to be disaster recovery dollars to rebuild. We are in the most pivotal point of the Mississippi Gulf Coast history right now.
Yeah, I feel it. I feel it. And maybe I have to write about it in a different way. I've written 7 or 8 columns about it. Some people tend to focus a little bit too much on the what. I think a Coastal Mississippi Economic Development Alliance, but I'm going to start focusing less on the what and get a little bit more fired up about the why. When we come back on the other side, we'll pick it up from right there with Ashley Edwards. We'll see you after this. Welcome back to the Ricky Matthews Show. We're talking with Ashley Edwards, who recently gave a TED Talk at Southern Miss, the very first speaker for the very first TED Talk, and it was great. It's going to be actually out there on YouTube within the next 3 or 4 weeks. There'll be TED Talk folks will be posting on YouTube. In the meantime, you only kind of have access to this kind of clunky player. I used it. It was fine once you worked with it and were patient with it at Southern Miss. We'll still post that link at the Ricky Matthews Show site so you can go look at it. But my sense is when it gets on the YouTube where it can be shared in a more wide way, people are going to pay attention to it. And maybe this show is something that you ought to store away and share with people as well, because we're talking about disruption and how fast it's happening as it relates to the blue economy. A blue economy, I think, is a great way to kind of frame what our economy is. And you can go back to the beginning of this show to be reminded of that if you missed that. But we're still talking about disruption. We're just not focused on it the way we need to. Ashley, at the end of the day, we are not focused on it the way we need to. And so when you think about disruption and the way we should be embracing our future, when I write, I write about over 92,000 jobs in shipbuilding, government, and gaming, just in those three segments. Over 92,000 direct and indirect jobs. To me, that's really scary when you consider that government spending can go in a bunch of different directions. Gaming competitions going up dramatically. I mean, Alabama, I spent a lot of time in Alabama. I know the people of Alabama. They missed, approving gaming last legislative session by one vote. It would have not only made gaming facilities legal, they would have had a lottery. They would have also fixed this kind of weird thing that they allowed the Indians to do through their casinos. That would have been fixed. They would have been preeminent competitors, and they will get it fixed in this next session, I predict. We're not thinking about that. We're not thinking about not having sports betting online. I don't like it, but from a competitive point of view, we don't have all our arrows in the quiver. The competition is getting more and more. I could go on and on. I've written about all these things. And then when you look at AI and where that's headed, dude, we got some serious threat in our future. And I'm just concerned that I don't know who's thinking about these things. We're certainly not having a public discussion about it. Who is supposed to be thinking about these things, Ashley?
Well, I think that's kind of the $1 trillion question, or maybe we call it $100 trillion question. It's interesting. You and I, Ricky, have talked a lot on past shows about visionaries like Elon Musk. And, I like to watch the things that he says, because I truly believe that one of the things that sets him apart from so many others is he's one of those guys that has the ability to see the future. He knows what is coming. And so few people really can grasp that. And I think that's the difficulty. The difficulty with all of our systems, and I'm not picking on any one person, whether it's a local elected official or a state elected official or a federal official or business leaders. I mean, our educational institutions, heck, our companies. I mean, gosh, Ricky, there's at least 4 or 5 times a week that I'm fussing at myself in the mirror, saying the things that we're doing to keep our own business going. We're acting like dinosaurs. It's archaic. But we're going to get left behind if we don't change. And in some ways, it's really incumbent upon everybody to have this understanding of we've got to be ready for what's happening here, because it is going to affect our lives in ways that we truly cannot comprehend.
Listen, I watched Joe Rogan did another segment with Elon Musk, and they got into some of the details about what's happening in the robotic side of Tesla. And dude, that is real as real can be. And people need to, he can see the future, but he's not only seeing the future, he's actually creating the future as he's talking. And so what he did, people can scream all day long about division and all that crap as it relates to X as a platform. But what he revealed about bias in the process is extremely important. So he's changing the way we communicate. He's changing the way we think about free speech. The robotic side of this is going to blow up the world. He's about to unleash a new kind of car that's more like an airplane than it is a car, and own and own and own. And then, man, when they talk about AI and how fast AI is changing, he said in that show that coders humans won't even be writing code anymore. Okay. The power is going to be in how you give AI instructions to write the code, but that's where we're headed. The world is literally changing so rapidly. And the point that you made is like Katrina times, a factor of 100, but we're not currently aligning as a set of communities in Coastal Mississippi to accept that reality. And it bothers me greatly. And I wonder where we're going from here. But Ashley, we're out of time, my friend. I wish we had 10 more segments, but we'll get back together again in the next 2 or 3 weeks. And we're going to continue this conversation. I can assure you. Thank you, my friend.
Well, thank you, Ricky. It's always an honor to come on. You're a real visionary, and always enjoy hearing what you have to say. So thank you for having me today.
Thank you for doing that TED Talk. I know the prep on that was insane, man, because I know what they expect to make a great TED Talk. You just don't go do a speech, man. It's a big deal. Listen, thank you. It's been Ashley Edwards. Have a great day, and we'll see you tomorrow.